What if I told you that Max Verstappen's front row start in the chaotic Las Vegas qualifying was hiding a technical discovery inside the Red Bull RB21 that Laurent Mekies did not reveal until after the session, a detail that changed the entire understanding of Verstappen's performance. You saw Verstappen finish in the second position, but you did not see the invisible enemy he was fighting. The RB21 only works inside an extremely narrow operating window, and the freezing Las Vegas rain pushed the car to the brink of falling out of that window from the very first corner. And when Red Bull analyzed the data after qualifying, Mekies found exactly what he feared. The RB21 had spent most of the session losing tire temperature, losing aerodynamic stability and reacting unpredictably to water on the surface, forcing Verstappen to rescue performance with pure skill. Stay right here, because once you discover what Mekies uncovered inside the RB21, how the conditions nearly broke the car and how Verstappen kept it alive long enough to secure the front row, you will see that this qualifying session was far more dramatic than the timing sheets suggest. The Las Vegas qualifying session delivered some of the harshest conditions the grid had faced all season. Rain swept across the circuit with irregular intensity, turning the asphalt into a surface that refused to generate grip and punishing every car that relied on tire temperature to perform. Max Verstappen entered the session fully aware that the Red Bull RB21 was a machine that prospered only when it remained within an extremely narrow operating window. The cold night, the water pooling on the straights and the constant spray created the perfect environment to push the car out of that fragile zone. From the moment he left the garage, Verstappen sensed that the night would test the limits of both the car and his own adaptability. As the rain intensified, visibility shrank until Verstappen was driving through a tunnel of mist illuminated only by blurred lights and reflections bouncing off the wet surface. In these conditions, every breaking point became a guess, every apex a hidden mark waiting under sheets of water. The RB21 did not offer him immediate confidence. The tires cooled rapidly on the long straights and never built the heat required for the aerodynamic platform to settle. Verstappen felt the car slide unexpectedly in the middle of corners, giving him a balance that shifted from understeer to oversteer in seconds. It was already evident that he was wrestling a machine that could lose stability with even the slightest change in temperature. The challenge deepened when the engineers monitoring real-time telemetry confirmed what Verstappen was feeling inside the cockpit. Tire temperatures were dropping sector by sector, and each drop weakened the aerodynamic grip generated by the floor. The RB21 depends heavily on stable airflow beneath the chassis, but the water streaming across the track disrupted that flow, creating small pockets of turbulence that destabilized the car in ways no setup change could counter. Verstappen was not only driving in the wet. He was fighting a platform that refused to remain in the zone where it could generate predictable downforce. Despite the worsening conditions, Verstappen approached each run with calculated aggression. He explored the edges of grip in places where the track still offered a hint of stability, adapting his technique lap by lap as the water level changed across the circuit. Red Bull engineers limited their radio messages to avoid distracting him, recognizing that the RB21 required constant micro-adjustments from Verstappen simply to remain on the limit. The car responded differently every time he entered a corner. Sometimes it gripped well enough to rotate cleanly. Other times it sailed wide as though the tires were sliding over a thin film of water. Verstappen had no choice but to recalibrate continuously. The tension in the garage rose each time Verstappen began a timed lap. The data showed he was working at the edge of the car's aerodynamic stability, a point where one misjudged input could send the RB21 into a slide that the wet surface would not forgive. But each time, Verstappen adapted. He modulated braking pressure, delayed power application and adjusted steering angles with the precision of someone who understood every beat of the RB21's pulse. The car was fragile. The environment was hostile. Yet Verstappen refused to let the qualifying session slip away. By the end of the session, Verstappen crossed the line with a lap strong enough for the second position, a result that stunned even those inside Red Bull. What looked from the outside like a straightforward front row start was, in reality, the product of a driver holding together a car that the conditions were trying to tear apart. And when Mekies later revealed what the data truly showed about the RB21's behavior, the entire narrative changed. Verstappen had not simply driven fast. He had survived a qualifying session in which the car was dangerously close to collapsing outside its operating window. The central problem Verstappen faced in Las Vegas qualifying was rooted in the extreme sensitivity of the Red Bull RB21. The car had been competitive throughout the season, but only when it operated within a very narrow range of tire temperature and aerodynamic stability. The freezing rain and the constantly changing grip levels of the Las Vegas street circuit pushed the RB21 toward the edge of that operating window from the very first lap. Verstappen felt this immediately as the car hesitated on turn-in and slid unpredictably through the early corners, signaling that the tires were unable to store the heat required to support the aerodynamic platform. The balance was fragile, and the slightest mistake would have pushed the car out of its zone entirely. As the rain intensified, the RB21's weaknesses became clearer. The tires lost core temperature on the long straights, leaving Verstappen with a cold front axle and a rear end that responded inconsistently to his inputs. Telemetry later showed that this temperature drop was more extreme than Red Bull had anticipated, creating a mismatch between the car's design and the conditions of the night. Verstappen found himself fighting a chassis that alternated between under-rotation and sudden over-rotation, behaviors that made it impossible to trust the car fully. The unpredictability meant he had to approach each corner as if it were new, relying on instinct rather than rhythm. The tricky part for Verstappen was that the RB21 offered no stable reference point. In normal wet sessions, a driver can eventually identify the places on the track where the car behaves consistently. But Las Vegas provided no such anchor. The water moved across the circuit with every lap, and the cold surface punished any attempt to lean on the tires. Verstappen would enter a corner expecting understeer, only to feel the rear snap. The next lap, the opposite happened. This inconsistency was not simply a result of driver error or overdriving. It was the direct reflection of a car that refused to settle into its aerodynamic pattern. Another layer of difficulty emerged from the RB21's aerodynamic dependence. The floor of the car is engineered to deliver strong ground effect when the chassis sits within a precise right height window. But the rain disrupted airflow beneath the car and reduced the effectiveness of the pressure tunnels that normally generate stability. Verstappen was essentially driving a machine that could lose grip with the smallest interaction of standing water. Mekies and the engineers monitoring the data saw moments in the lap where the aerodynamic load dropped sharply, causing the car to float above the surface rather than dig into it. This was an aerodynamic fragility that could not be solved with driving adjustments alone. The temperature of the tires played an even larger role in destabilizing the platform. In the RB21, the tire temperature controls the degree to which the floor can operate efficiently. When the tires cool below a specific threshold, the car lifts slightly, breaking the suction effect of the ground effect system. In Las Vegas, the tires dropped below the threshold repeatedly, especially on the straights. This meant Verstappen began each braking zone with tires that were too cold to grip and a floor that no longer produced the downforce the car depended on. He was driving a machine that kept losing the mechanical and aerodynamic pillars it needed to function. By the middle of the session, the problem was unavoidable. Verstappen was not fighting the track. He was fighting the RB21 itself. The car refused to remain inside its delicate operating window, and each lap threatened to push it further away from stability. Mekies understood instantly that the issue was not setup or performance. It was the environment. The cold rain, the lack of temperature retention and the fragile aerodynamic structure created a situation where Verstappen had to wrestle the car simply to keep it competitive. This problem defined the entire night and set the foundation for the discovery Mekies would reveal once the session ended. Laurent Mekies began the post-qualifying review by examining the thermal profile of the tires, and it revealed immediately why Verstappen had been fighting for control throughout the session. The tires never entered the core temperature window the RB21 requires to generate stable aerodynamic load. Instead, the temperatures fell progressively with each straight, stripping grip before Verstappen even reached the braking zones. Mekies recognized this pattern from earlier simulations, but the real-world data showed a far more aggressive temperature collapse than expected. This was the first sign that the RB21 had spent the entire session operating precariously close to losing its aerodynamic foundation. The next step in the analysis was the aerodynamic load graph, and what Mekies found confirmed his concerns. The RB21 was experiencing fluctuations in downforce that did not match the expected influence of rain alone. The car's design demands a precise combination of tire temperature, ride height, and airflow stability. In Las Vegas, all three conditions were compromised at the same time. The rain distorted the airflow beneath the floor, the tires cooled beyond acceptable limits, and the ride height shifted as a result of those thermal drops. Mekies could see these shifts in the data as abrupt dips and spikes that indicated the car was never fully settled through any phase of the lap. A critical part of the RB21's concept lies in its underfloor tunnels, which must maintain smooth airflow to create suction and stabilize the car. In the wet, however, water infiltrates these tunnels and disrupts the pressure distribution that the system depends on. Mekies discovered that during Verstappen's fastest laps, small but measurable pockets of disrupted airflow appeared beneath the chassis, each time reducing the car's total downforce. These drops were not catastrophic, but they were perfectly aligned with the moments when Verstappen reported sudden slides or delayed steering response. This confirmed that the car was losing aerodynamic consistency with every lap.